All right, please join me in welcoming back director and editor and DP, Leslie Tai. So last time you were at our festival, you had a short called My American Surrogates. So between that and this film, can you talk about your interest in movies about Chinese people having babies in the United States?
Yeah, so the My American Surrogate was actually about like a tangential phenomenon. So as I was as I was getting to know maternity hotel boss ladies, a lot of them were in the midst of like trying to get out of the birth tourism industry and like get into surrogacy and fertility treatment because they saw that as like higher end, more profit. And so one of the women that I met ended up really going in that direction. So originally I wanted to end this film with like something about surrogacy, but then it just became like a little, an offshoot, I think like worthy of its own sort of film.
Okay, so how did you then first get to meet all of these women? Was it first about this business, or was it about individual people?
Yeah, it was first. So I spent a lot of time in China. So I lived in China for like 7 years, and then came back to the States to do my graduate studies in film. And then at some point, like a colleague of mine who I met in Beijing was in Los Angeles under mysterious circumstances. So I found out that she was actually having a baby, and at the time she was like dating like a wealthier, older man, and they were not married, and so she had like a very specific situation, and she's the one who sort of opened the door, like called me and was like, you won't believe where I'm living and what I'm doing and this whole world that I'm in. So she was really very much the like person who sort of told us about it, and then that's how we started getting into the world of Chinese birth tourism.
Okay, so from there how did you meet all these women then?
Okay, so my producer and partner, Jillian, who is right there, we met in Beijing, and so we were this like dynamic duo wherein we started we understood, so like the thing to understand about this phenomenon is like everyone is sort of involved in it. Like every Chinese person who lives in the San Gabriel Valley like knows about it or has heard, is somehow connected to this, knows somebody, so my mom's friend whose house I was staying at, like her cleaning, or her former nanny became like one of these nurses for infants. And so anyways, we had all these leads, and really we started responding to ads in ChineseInLA.com, which is like the Craigslist for Chinese people. And at the time, I also had a distant cousin in China who was asking me like, oh, what is this thing? Can you help us find more information? So I had this perfect sort of, me and Jillian were, like I'm an ABC, but both of us speak Chinese. And so we just called up all these people. We were like, my cousin, is interested. And it was really easy. And we were pretty clear that we needed to get to know some of the maternity hotel boss ladies. And we're really thinking about like, well, what would they get out of this, and what could we do for them or whatever. And all of that really fell into place because we hadn't anticipated how much they wanted us in their lives. So like a lot of them don't speak English, a lot of them have been living here, but they don't really have access to, like, anyways, they just really needed us and wanted us to be in their world to help like unlock aspects of American society. They would like, I have a phone bill, I have a electricity bill from Edison, can you please call them for me? So it was very much like everyone we met was super enthusiastic about meeting us, and then they would eventually ask what my line of work was, and I would say, oh, I'm a documentary camera person. And then they would all just like get out, like let's make a film about this. And I was like, okay, so this is a lot easier than we thought, because the idea for the film is coming from the participants themselves. So we kind of, after we understood that this was going to be a common refrain, we just sort of like let everybody propose the idea to us. And it was insane because everyone knew that they were part of something like pretty crazy, and that it was super widespread, but like flying under the radar, and there were so many stories, and they all really wanted to see something that showed these stories. So in that way, we sort of let them come up with the idea, and that's how we sort of started.
Can you elaborate on this more? Because I imagine some of them are reluctant to have this story out there, or even though it's sort of like an open secret, that maybe this would become public in a way and mainstream in a way in the United States that they're not quite ready for.
Okay, so this also gets to a really interesting point that I like to talk about, which is like how often as a young woman, like you get underestimated, like your abilities, and like what you're gonna do. So I feel like most of the people, like they agreed to it, but it's not like they really thought that it was anything was necessarily gonna come of it, right? Because I'm a one-woman band, I did everything by myself, I shot double system sound with a fanny pack, like it wasn't like the best, you know, situation. So that was one thing. And the other thing was, well, the historical background is that there were these FBI raids that had just happened. So yeah, we were concerned that people would not want to be a part of it. But the thing about the people that were coming to give birth was there was a lot of misinformation, but it was 100% legal. So if you do it the right way, which means just telling the truth, then you're clear, you're in the clear. It's the people who are not telling the truth about why they're coming that they might get in trouble later on down the line. So everyone who participated in the film knew that they hadn't done anything wrong. And so, because it was like also the heat of the moment, and in that time it was like a very fashionable thing, they agreed because they knew they weren't doing anything wrong. The people who did do something wrong, like asked to have their identities sort of their faces blurred, and so you see some of that in here. I don't know if you noticed, but it's like we did it very subtly, but there's some people whose faces are covered.
Can you talk about blurring as, I mean, I'm thinking about it as an aesthetic thing too, like I'm watching a documentary and a blur stands out. It's like you want it to disappear, but yet it stands out at the same time. Yeah. Can you just talk about, like, why even include that shot, for instance?
Oh, right, like, okay, so, yeah, so this film was interesting in the sense that, aesthetically speaking, I was trying to make it feel like fiction. So I kind of started with this anamorphic lens, and I had this lockdown setup, these beautiful tableau shots, and that was sort of the aesthetic I was going for. But then very soon, it was just like a really, it was like not low footprint. I took like, it was a monster setup, and it took a really long time to do, and I couldn't catch things on the fly. So immediately I had to change my plan and develop like a handheld version. So a lot of it is being, like working that aesthetic to be true to the actual act of documentary filmmaking. So there's one moment in the final film where like you sort of become aware of my presence. So that was important. And then so the reason I'm saying all this is because the blurring sort of also has the same function in the sense that I'm not trying to make you not aware of the fact that some people don't want their identities to be shown. And so actually the film's gonna be broadcast on PBS, and that version, which has more dissemination, right? This is only showing for you guys like at a handful of festivals, but for the version that's gonna be streaming online, there's like way heavier blurring, way more people, all the names are bleeped, like just out of like a overabundance of caution, just given like, I don't know, they didn't ask for it, but I'm just kind of doing it.
Can you talk about the birthing scene and your decision to be there for it, to shoot it, and then to include it in the film?
Yeah, so for us, it's the whole structure of the film and the journey that like the audience is meant to kind of go through really hinges upon that scene and that moment, because hopefully in our eyes or in our mind, it's the moment where, like, so we call it la la la, and then you fall off a cliff. So it's kind of like, maybe in the beginning, you know, all these women, they had, you know, they bought, you know, this package, they had this idea of, okay, this is gonna be a great time, almost like a vacation, you know, sunny Southern California, and then slowly, you start to understand that there's some medical risk involved. I think like that's supposed to build until the moment of the birth, when it's like the brutality of just childbirth in general, but compounded by the bedside manner of the doctor and the sort of violence in which, and she's all alone, like all of that is the antithesis of, I think, what the women think that they're in for, but also the audience, you know, maybe you come into it like, it's about like subverting your expectations, or like, you know, it's a point in which like people's perceptions shift about like why people are really doing this, or like what's really at stake.
There's another kind of undercurrent of violence that never turns into violence, thankfully, but the city council scene. I mean, one of the most remarkable things about the film is that it's not very political, right? You're just here for the woman. But in that moment, you feel a certain kind of, for us, kind of a familiar political reaction to this phenomenon. First of all, can you talk about like just being there for that, and then thinking about your own project, and then also its inclusion in this film, especially because that never quite intersects with the rest of the narrative either.
Yeah, so they all live in like pretty separate worlds. So I always knew, like early on in our research, we kind of hit up all the people that had spoken in the media. So we knew Alex Garcia, who is the head of the maternity hotel task force, like himself an undocumented person, like when he was young, and it was all of these different players, and the de facto mayor of Roland Heights, which is not really a city, but like he was a multi-generational Chinese who grew up in SF Chinatown, and all of these, like the way that, I was very curious about the way that they understood this phenomenon just from a visual standpoint, because the phenomenon is quite visible. But then there's this divide, right? So I had always written in my treatment that there was a neighbor like looking out the window. And so it was just like a weird confluence of luck and that I just happened to be there for these 2 town hall meetings that were specifically about this, you know, phenomenon in their community. And I think I made a version of the film that didn't include all of this, but then I think it was divorced from not only the Chinese industry, but also the local reaction. So my inclusion of it was also to sort of compound the, just like their stakes and the undercurrent of hostility that they may not have felt themselves, but I felt like as someone who knows all sides. Right. So it almost felt very dangerous for the women to be so like out there, like visibly in the community in a way drawing attention that they don't even realize. It's 2 separate worlds, so bringing in that risk or danger,
So I think I mentioned to you when I saw this movie, you and I are new parents. When I watched this movie, like my baby was taking a nap upstairs, and I was very emotionally invested in this, and I was kind of crying watching this movie, and I remember telling you that, and I can only imagine what it was like for you to be editing this movie, right, in post-production, when your own life is about to change, too. Can you just talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, well, I have to say the film took 9 years to make, so like we've been editing this for like 8 years. Okay. So a lot of the like initial like going through the material over and over and over and over and over again like happened before I was like anywhere near like this. And in a way you could imagine that it was a sort of research, right? Like I was 30 when I started making the film. And so maybe what drew me to it was really I wanted to, you know, understand what this was all about. So it didn't really impact me during the making of it. I just knew that I felt really helpless in that situation. I'd only felt like helpless one other time in my life in regards to like somebody that I cared about who was like in a medical environment, which was my grandma at an old people's home, and she was getting showered or cleaned by like a nurse person, and I just like didn't know I didn't know if what was happening was like right or wrong. Like I didn't have a frame of reference. It didn't feel right, but then I also didn't feel like empowered to step in. And I think like I felt the same way during that birth. I mean, she was all alone and I was translating for her, but I knew what was happening, what had happened in the room next door. And I also knew the doctor. I filmed with the doctor and I just stood there and I was like, okay, I'm just gonna bear witness and all of this is on camera. So it was like a very, obviously like I just heard about what happened and I just was like, this is crazy. I don't know why the doctor is allowing me to film this, but I'm filming this and it's almost like all I could do to sort of protect the woman in a way. So, is that, okay.
Yeah. Sean, I'm sure there's some questions from the audience if anybody wants to ask Leslie a question. Yeah, right here.
So, I specifically see that for 1 year later, the woman that you filmed the birth wasn't included.
Yeah.
Why?
That's a really good question. It's really a structural issue. So I had 1 year laters with everybody, but like hers was pretty like, it was important because what she was saying was like, I'm back to my normal life. Shanghai is great. I'm happy here. Our immediate future plans are to stay here because we see this as like a better economic, like for our career development. Staying in China is better, but at some point we need to go to the United States. I guess like I always knew that the film needed to end on both Lola's story, Bing's story, who closes down a maternity hotel, and like Sam and Sling's story. And so in a way, like her story didn't hit on an emotional level at the same level because she was like her takeaway was like, actually, I don't really think that this American baby is gonna amount to much in my life, which I think is important, but I had too many epilogues, so that one kind of got cut.
Other questions? Yeah.
So from what I was able to see, like there's this potential implication that maybe could be a higher chance of malpractice or infant mortality, I guess, or maybe that's just going to be left inconclusive because of lack of resources and interpretation services. But I was wondering if you were able to just behind the scenes get any data on that. And obviously, we don't see things from the lens of the medical providers or the doctors. So that's a big question mark in my head. Do you have
I mean, what you take away from it is pretty much what happened. I mean, obviously I became like her de facto, person who was like dealing with the hospital, and it was really just like depressing, and like I felt just as helpless. Like we were in this situation where the mortuary needed the doctor to sign the death certificate in order for the morgue to release the body, but then the doctor wouldn't sign it because he said that the cause of death was inconclusive and they needed an autopsy. But like you can't get the autopsy unless the morgue releases the body. It was like way beyond. I was like, oh my God, something like really messed up is happening right now. And so I just helped her get a lawyer, and eventually the LA County Coroner's Office did an autopsy and found that the baby passed away because there's like a first reason and a second reason, and the first one was that the baby was just too big, and then the second one was like brain bleeding. But ultimately a bunch of birth injury lawyers like tried to take up the case, and I kind of helped with all of that, but then they eventually just decided they didn't have a case. So she didn't really get, nothing, came of it.
Other questions? In the back. Yeah.
So, I don't remember the name, but child passed away. Are you saying that now?
Yeah, and I actually have great news. She had another baby. during COVID, and also a boy by the same partner. So she's happy. She got what, she got the family that she wanted.
Yeah, right.
Can you elaborate on the last shot?
Yeah. I think like the whole concept of the 1 year later was to kind of, the whole film sort of happens in the American like familiar landscape. And it was really important for the 1 year later to be like all in China and to have a little bit of a quality of like, you don't even recognize these people because you didn't think of them in the context of their own society. And that hopefully that context will answer a lot of questions that, some viewers might have had. So the final shot, I mean, it's really about, Lila's her name, like Lila, is she a victim, right? I mean, she's the one character that you go into a real deep rabbit hole with her backstory and you find out she was an abandoned baby, she lived in a really poor place where people still go hungry, all this stuff. And I think it's a big surprise that she ends up being, not married to this man. And, but in a way, it was just about her like surviving and like sort of her having agency, like having the kind of choices, making her own choices in life given the very limited set of options that she has. And so it's kind of like, if I can't have a child, but I can stay in this relationship and I can get my facial, like, you know what I mean? It's kind of like this complacency, this very dark but real kind of aspect, I feel like, that colors Chinese society.
She was living in the biggest house.
Yeah, I mean, it was a nice house. Like, yeah.
Well, based on the epilogue.
Yeah, which she would not have if she didn't like stay in her current situation. So it's just like you think about all the women that are coming and you don't have any idea where they're coming from or like what is the context of their life. And I feel like her context was like really mind-blowing and like really specific, but her story is like a lot of women, most of the women had just as complicated backstories as her. So it's not all just like middle class, people who are frivolously, spending money to do a thing. Like everyone's just trying to survive. And I think it was important to sort of show the context of their Chinese life. So a lot of people are like, oh, this is about America, but I really think it's about China. The film is more about Chinese society and like why, like what are the forces that would cause a woman to like believe that this is something that she desired and then to go forth and like do it. And the discrepancy really between like what the American view is of this phenomenon and like what the Chinese view is of it, or the human view of it.
Rare?
So they let you have a real intimate view of their lives, and now we're 8 years later. Are you still in touch with them? They're new after one.
Yeah, a lot of people are like, you should follow them until they're 18 and see if they actually come to America, right? And I can say that due to COVID, like all of them have like scrapped any plans to sort of, because back then it was like, okay, now that we have our American baby, like how do we actually, like what do we do next to kind of, do we go, like what is that threshold in which they will still be Chinese enough and have enough of a basis of their own language and like STEM, and then still be like, how can they retain their Chineseness while like not being at a disadvantage in American society, because clearly these American babies are gonna go to school here. And so I was obviously their like in-house expert about all of that. And so a lot of them were like, okay, when we're 11, we're gonna grab a group of mothers and we'll just like take turns taking care of our group of kids. You know what I mean? It was like a really wild, idea of how we were gonna bring our babies back and like actually have them grow up here. Very complicated. So I think, in China, the political situation has changed. It's very anti-American. Whereas like in the sort of heyday of this phenomenon, it was definitely like a status symbol. It was something that people were very proud of. Now it's like maybe less so. One of the moms told me that they weren't planning to like tell their child that they had this option, and so I think it's really changed in terms of how they relate to what they did also.
And what passport you opt to have in China?
Yeah, because they all
very
have this
politicized.
option, right? They like part of the whole deal of getting the American passport is like you can still have your Chinese passport, and then you don't have to decide until you're 18. So it's like an insurance policy, or it's like a choice that you're leaving for the future, like intensive future planning for your child. Like, oh, when my child is 18, who knows what the balance of the world powers is going to be? They can choose what country they want to be a citizen of at that time. So I think they're just kind of like have now just put it in their back pocket and are very much just like moving on with their lives in China.
Other questions? In the back.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that this is sort of a situation now that the American figures of the America have also declined. So is this still very much the same? So as you mentioned,
Yeah.
there are some of the bosses want to go into surrogate and try to that. So is that still a phenomenon?
Well, it's really like always been hard to say, you know, really no one's done research. There's not like really accurate data. So all I can base it off of is like all of the accounts we followed on WeChat and like how active they still are. And, you know, pretty much nobody who was in my film is like still involved. COVID really, when China shut down, it really put an end to like a large scale version of this phenomenon, but many accounts were still active and talking about how you could enter the United States through like Mexico or whatever. So it was still happening, but at a much, much smaller scale. And then now that China's open again and people can travel more or less freely, again, I think everyone sort of thinks it will continue, but I don't know like exactly, you know, what the trend is currently.
And was there like an even split in terms of who was making most of the profit off of this? Is it
Even split?
like who was making more money? Was the bosses here making the money? Was it like folks in China?
Oh yeah, so the way that the industry works is that there are agents in China, and they're just really middlemen that like middle people that connect you, and they take like 30%. So, I mean, I don't know if they were making a killing, and then the people that they were connecting with over here that were running maternity hotels, a lot of them were just like small scale mom and pop operations. The ones that were like huge operations were the ones that kind of got, I think 5 people got indicted by the FBI, or not by the FBI, but they were the raids. The result of the raids were that 5 of the biggest companies were indicted on charges of visa fraud, money laundering, and they were probably making a lot of money.
Other questions? Is that a hand?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lily's story was the one that I was like touched the most. So was she the only mistress of the group?
No, I mean, they are not all in one group. So Lila, I met her at the hospital, so she was on like her own maternity hotel. I didn't know any of the people that she stayed with, but ironically enough, I knew the company that I knew the maternity hotel company from my research in China when I was visiting all their info sessions. And I had like a relationship kind of, and they were kind of like not into me at all. So like for them to find out that I happened to be in America, like befriending this woman who was gonna be like destroy their business with, if she ever came out with their story, was like the funnest. Like me and Lola had so much fun, like teasing her maternity hotel operator, and being like, I don't know, it was super messed up. So the maternity hotel boss ladies call like the women who come alone are the ones that are mistresses. And there was like a third of them were that. And I had to stay, I was living in like a condo with one of the women who came alone. So it was quite common.
Yeah, right?
I've got a question about like making a film kind of with two languages in mind at the same time. Like there's all of these moments of like really like crystalline like these like beautiful like poetic like things that I'm reading in the movie. Like the one that first hit me was when she's like, "This is God's country after all." And then like every scene I was like, whoa, like that one really hits, like it hits like perfectly in subtitle. And I'm wondering what the process was like when you're editing the film. Are you reading it as you're, like did you already have the translations like in the form that they were gonna be in? Because of course there's like creative decisions in there. Were you thinking about it as text? Were you hearing it in Chinese? Like how are you putting it together kind of with two languages in mind at the same time?
Thank you for that question. I feel like most filmmakers are looking at like the image and the sound, but like for all of my films that happen to be in the Chinese language for an or a Western English reading audience, they all have subtitles. So like, you know, I study graphic design, so like down to the way that they look, you know, is controlled. But like, there's such an art to subtitling in the sense that they have to like convey the essence of what's being said without being too long, and then staying there long enough for you to read it, but then not feel like it's, and I don't know if I achieved this, you know, obviously some of these are a bit long and a bit short in terms of duration, sorry about that, but so I always think about like where the audience is gonna be directing their attention. So it's like, when for the PBS version, I was faced with the task of adding lower thirds, which means names for all the people, I had to then insert this, like, because if you look at the name, you're gonna miss what the image is, and then you're also not gonna see what is being said. So it's this like really intricate calculation or design of the subtitles. And I'm fluent in both languages. I kind of worked as a interpreter and translator, not at a very high level, but for the arts community and the documentary film community when I was in China. So the process was I had interns and they did rough translations. So like kind of, you know, just getting the ideas up there. And that helped for like the first editor that I worked with who was non-Chinese speaking, but afterwards it was just me editing. So I was always editing the subtitles and the way things were being said, like throughout the entire film editing process. And even for the PBS version, I had to like shorten, because they have this logo boundary, and so I was like, I can't do it, like I can't. And then finally I relented, and so I had to like rephrase a lot of stuff and make them all shorter. So it's like an ongoing pain in the butt, like part of the process.
Never thought about the aesthetics of the PBS logo that is on the screen.
And the answer is like, they may not apply the logo knowing that you have a subtitle film, but I cannot guarantee that it won't cover your subtitles and therefore render your film like illegible. And I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, right here.
Hi, I just wanted to, I did not know I was going to come to the San Diego Asian Film Festival and know that I was going to learn so much from a film. And I just wanted to thank you for giving so much of your life to teach all of us, you know, the good, the bad, and the awareness that you brought to all of us. And I thought it was, the way you did it was beautiful. And I just thank you for your work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, on that note, do you want to tell us about the upcoming PBS broadcast so they can get the word out about this film?
Oh yeah, so it's going to be broadcast on national public television on December 11th at 10 p.m. on your local PBS station and local PBS stations across the country. And then it'll be streaming online for 90 days. So if you guys, want to watch it again and see a version where I've like named everyone, so you can like follow along, but they're all fake names, but at least you can like follow who everyone is. Or if you just want to let other people know about it, it'll be available on pbs.org and the PBS app.
Well, we really appreciate you sharing this version with us today. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Leslie, for sharing your insights.
Thanks, Brian.